McNeill never stopped dreaming of a career in football. Then came the pep talk that changed his life. It's a wonderful life. This realization, though, is sometimes only reached by surviving what it can throw at the bullied, the anxious, the bereaved and the desperate. It's my favorite movie, says Paul McNeill of It's a Wonderful Life, the Christmas staple that celebrates the power of love, the resilience of goodness and the rewards of giving. His personal tribute to gratitude has been captured on film by his employers at the Scottish Football Association and posted on social media. "Football saved my life," he says. It is a simple but powerful message that echoes in everything he does as head of community development at the SFA. The video stretches to mere minutes, but the life and lessons of McNeill deserve further elaboration. His story testifies to the importance of football in an age where the beautiful game can be disfigured by the eternal obsession with money and ruthlessness, its constant companions. At 44, McNeill has lived a life of tragedy and triumph, of despair and hope, of a particular nightmare and a specific dream. It is cinematic in scope. It can be summarized, crudely but hopefully effectively, in 3 scenes. Scene 1, I was really struggling and I fell into football. And I fell in love with it, says McNeill, a Street Mirren supporter whose enthusiasm has never diminished, despite the routine dunce that accompany such a fate. I remember my first game. It was a magical thing. Walking along Love Street, going up the hill and seeing the old-fashioned stadium, floodlights, the green grass. Wow. I was 6. McNeill scored. It was an escape from the trials of everyday life. We were poor but my mom and dad were good people, hard-working, with good values, he says of his upbringing in Paisley. It was school that was the problem. I was bullied, shouted at. It was torture. McNeill was dyslexic in an age when primary schools had no strategy to cope with such a pupil. Basically, they thought I was thick, he says. You are a problem. That was the attitude. But my mom is an angel. She fought tooth and nail, she didn't give up on me. Nobody picked up on my dyslexia at primary school. He says that secondary school was different. There was a sort of realization that, he's not thick, he has a learning difficulty. I was a genius at history, for example, because I could remember dates and pieces of information. But it was still tough. I always wanted to do something in sport as a career but the problem was that, academically, I was struggling because of the dyslexia. He had a refuge. I was pretty rubbish at football, he says. But I loved it. Lived for it. I was a defender. At primary school nobody wants to play left back, but my mate said, he will play there. And I did. He still had hope, but it was dwindling. I left school at 15 and I wanted to be a teacher, but the academic side looked impossible. One day, my dad came into the room where I was sitting with application forms for jobs. He said, fill this in for your mom, she never asks much. She's worried about you. I was down after a decade of being abused at school, teachers shouting and bawling and making me feel rubbish about myself. The voice cracks 30 years on. The forms were filled. McNeill was heading to the shipyards as an apprentice electrician. Scene 2, it was Christmas time. I was 22 years old. I was just a boy, really, not grown up. My mom and dad had split up. My dad took 100 paracetamols. He woke up briefly before he died. I did get to speak to him. He told me, I love you son. I am very proud of you. His father, Hugh, had been a hero and a fellow fan. McNeill looks out from a Hampton hospitality box and says, 1987. I close my eyes and I can still see the ball hitting the net. Crystal clear. I remember every goal, every game in that run, he says of a Scottish Cup campaign that ended with Street Mirren beating Dundee United 1-0. It was, however, a moment in 1985 that showed him how much football meant to him and those he knew and loved. It was the night Jock Stein died in Cardiff, he says of the tragedy of September 10 when the greatest Scottish football manager died after the national team had qualified for the World Cup in Spain after drawing with Wales. I sat watching it with my dad and his friends at his golf club, he says. There was talk of Stein collapsing. It was the days before social media. I think it was announced on teletext that Stein had died. I was surrounded by hearty, drinking guys. It goes silent. Then they start to talk about the memories. They had gone through so much together. They would say, remember that game, mind that goal. Even as a kid, I realized that football was what held these guys together. They had so much invested in it. It was imprinted on me, football can make a difference. More than a decade later, just after the death of his father, the significance of sport suddenly became stark. I didn't like the fact that my dream had gone, he says. I was a shipyard worker instead of chasing my ambition. It was tough. You are the bottom of a boat, freezing. I grew up in Paisley where murders took place, where people I went to school with are dead, or shot, or in jail. There is constant tragedy among friends. Suicide, violence. Is this where I am destined to be, at the bottom of a boat? Where is the 5-year-old with a dream? Where is the wee boy who wanted to be the first person to land on Mars and captain Scotland at a World Cup? A chance meeting changed his life. An oil chief executive came to the yard and I was told to show him the boat, says McNeill. We got talking. He told me he had a shoulder injury that wrecked his dream to be a quarterback. He told me his ambition was to buy an NFL franchise. I told him that it would cost tens of millions of dollars and he would never do it. He said, Paul, you have to have a dream. I thought, I used to have one. It was rekindled in that moment. He decided to go to dedicate himself to learning, to finding a way into sport. His mother, Anne, said she would support him. He adds, I was accepted for college. I threw my tools in the Clyde. Literally. Scene 3, I made the same walk. The same steps I took with my dad in '87. He was with me. I felt it. McNeill is talking about the day in 2006 when he arrived at Hampton for his interview as a regional manager for the SFA. It was more than a decade on from his father's suicide, more than a decade from the day his tools found a watery grave. The walk from Mount Florida was emotional. The interview was draining. I felt I left a part of my soul in that room, he says. I knew it was my Everest. Give up on your dreams, said some school teachers. Sod it. I gave it everything I had. His emergence from the bottom of the boat had been followed by gaining qualifications at both Glasgow City College and Abertay University. As soon as the lecturers knew I had dyslexia, they came up with a support plan. Suddenly, I was flying, says McNeill. He gained a job in men's health with the NHS in Lanarkshire and was pondering his next move when he saw a newspaper advertisement for the SFA job. I knew that this was where I wanted to be. It's easy to say football saved my life, but what does it mean? I played as a boy, as a teenager and as a young man. I have a debt to the volunteers who ran those teams, still do. They would say to me, you will be all right, you will do okay. There was always positivity. They made me feel good about myself. I meet them to this day and I always say thank you. They all laugh and try to brush it off. But it was vital to me. His job at the SFA is to manage grassroots programs in 6 regions. His passion, though, is to improve lives. He volunteers to help with his son's football team in his spare time. At work, he states his job definition is simple. I have to inspire. I have to make sure that we get the message across that our sport is the greatest sport in the world and it can change a human being's life. He adds, you can put a smile on the face of a young boy or girl and maybe help them become a more rounded, happier person. It happened to me. He has never forgotten that day the SFA phoned to say he had the job. I sat down and stared into space. It was in a spirit of gratitude, a thanks to the volunteers and my mum who stuck by me, he says. When I see my mum now, in a supermarket or wherever, she will shout across, see you later, my little ray of sunshine. I always burst out laughing. It seems one must know the darkness before fully appreciating the light.